But after the 9/11 attacks, he put his lucrative career aside and with his brother Kevin joined the U.S. Army. In April of 2004, Pat Tillman was an Army Ranger in Afghanistan, where he was shot and killed. Initially, the Army couched Pat Tillman's death in heroic terms. It told his family and the U.S. public that he was caught in an enemy ambush. The truth was that American bullets killed him. The Pentagon knew that, but waited 5 weeks before disclosing that it had been so-called friendly fire. 4 years later, after several investigations and 2 congressional hearings, Mary Tillman still wonders what actually happened to her son and why the government covered it up. She writes about it all in her new book, Boots on the Ground by Dusk, my tribute to Pat Tillman. She spoke about her son's story at the Commonwealth Club of California last month, and it's her talk there that we'll hear this hour on Word for Word. Mary Tillman began by reading an excerpt from her book. It provides a family backdrop for her son's story.
I hung up feeling overwhelmed, but unable to move or cry. I began to wonder what my father would think if he were alive. Like Mike and me, I knew he would be proud of Pat and Kevin for wanting to serve their country. Yet I wondered whether he would share my doubts about the administration. 35 years ago, he and I had been at odds over the Vietnam War. He died before seeing the outcome of that involvement. Would he have encouraged Pat and Kevin, or would he have feared, as I did now, that our family had glamorized the honor of military service? Discussions about the military had been part of the boys' childhood. Why people fight for their country, why they should, when it is right to do so. The effect of war on people, how it crushes them tragically or enables them to do heroic things. At dinner time and at holiday gatherings, our conversations had often turned to the military and its place in history and in our family. My sons were influenced by these stories and of our family's military past. My younger brothers, Richard and Mike, and I inherited an appreciation of history from many relatives, but our fascination with military history came directly from my father, Richard M. Spaulding, who had served as a Marine in the Korean War, and from my mother's brother, John Conlon, who had served in World War II and the Korean War, and then the National Guard. I'd majored in history at San Jose State University, and my ex-husband, Patrick, who was an economics major, had also studied history. My interest in military history, particularly the Civil War, developed during my frequent childhood visits to Gettysburg National Park in the mid-1960s. I was 10 to 12 years old when we lived in New Cumberland, Pennsylvania, less than 40 miles away from the historic battlefield. My father and mother took my brothers and me there nearly every weekend. With great poignancy, Dad would make the history of that war come alive for us. We could picture the Confederate troops advancing down the Chambersburg Pike on July 1st, 1863, the first day of the battle, and those Southern forces charging the Union position on the third day. To help us understand the tragedy of the valiant but futile Pickett's charge, Dad told us the story of the encounter at Cemetery Ridge on July 3rd, 1863, between Confederate Brigadier General Lewis Armistead and Union troops led by Major General Winfield Scott Hancock. These two men had met and became friends at West Point and served together in the same infantry in California before the Civil War. Armistead was wounded on Cemetery Ridge. He asked if he could see his adversary and once good friend, General Hancock, but was told Hancock had been wounded just minutes earlier. Although Armistead's wounds had not appeared to be life-threatening, he died the morning of July 5th in a Union field hospital. It was haunting to know that these two friends had fought against each other. Both had been wounded in the same skirmish, and one had died. We often had picnics on a knoll between Little Round Top and Devil's Den and dangled our feet in a creek near Spangler Spring. My father bought us Confederate and Union hats that we wore as we ran through the fields, climbing rocks and trees in the vast historical park. The statues, monuments, and cannons that memorialized the soldiers who fought there demanded reverence. and Dad made it very clear that climbing on the monuments was disrespectful. But sometimes we forgot ourselves, and Dad would catch us and get angry. I vividly remember being yanked firmly from an equestrian statue of Major General John Sedgwick and feeling ashamed and embarrassed. The museums, the cemetery, and the home of Ginny Wade, the only civilian to be killed at the Battle of Gettysburg, fascinated me. My ghoulish little brothers were particularly intrigued by the replica field hospital, where bloody wax arms and legs were thrown into a barrel by a window. They referred to it as the Arms and Legs Museum. My father earnestly and patiently talked to us about battles, strategies, and tactics. I remember him telling us that prior to the Battle of Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee often had split his troops into sections. He did it out of necessity, and he got away with it because of the incompetence of Northern generals. However, my father cautioned that it was never a good idea to do that because troops can lose communication with one another, resulting in confusion and chaos. During the time we visited Gettysburg, former President Dwight David Eisenhower was living at his Gettysburg home. We once walked into the Gettysburg Library and saw him sitting at a table reading. I remember being in awe of this honored and respected World War II general, even though he was by then a frail old man. From 1944 through 1945, Eisenhower had been responsible for planning and directing the successful invasion of France and Germany by Allied forces. And still, he cautioned against governments using military strength and resources to achieve political and commercial gain. As children, we played military games while visiting my Uncle John. I knew that during World War II, he had been the last soldier to parachute safely out of a crashing plane, and he had been so shaken by that experience that he never boarded another plane once he got out of the military. Uncle John had no children of his own, so his nieces and nephews were like his kids. Often, when we would visit him in Newark, Ohio, he would set up his military tent for us in the backyard in the summer and in the living room in the winter. We would sit in the tent eating Army rations, which were pretty terrible, and garlic popcorn. While Uncle John rarely spoke to us of his military experiences, he would take us to military cemeteries and Army bases. Once, when he and my grandmother visited us in Nyack, New York, they took me to West Point. I was only 3 years old, but I still remember the ornate swords and rifles displayed behind glass in one of the buildings. My parents took my brothers and me back to West Point when I was 13 and living in Tenafly, New Jersey. The statues and buildings were old, formidable, and impressive. I didn't notice the plebes my first visit to the campus, but 10 years later, they were the main attraction. Military service was part of the life of my husband's family as well, which of course became familiar to my sons. Their paternal grandfather, Hank Tillman, and 2 great-uncles had served in the Navy, and all were stationed at Pearl Harbor when it was bombed by the Japanese. All 3 survived. My father-in-law did not talk about his painful wartime experiences, but he occasionally spoke of the fun times and camaraderie. I found his stories fascinating. One New Year's Eve, my husband, Patrick, and I went to a party and left 2-month-old Pat with my in-laws. After several hours, I left the party to go feed the baby, intending to return before midnight to celebrate the new year. But I ended up talking with my mother-in-law, Mary, my husband's youngest brother, David, and Hank, who started telling stories about hitchhiking, drinking, and just hanging out with his Navy buddies. My dad, like my father-in-law, didn't talk much about the specifics of military service or any horrors he might have seen. It wasn't until after he died that I learned his best friend had been blown up by a landmine just yards in front of him. When he talked about the Marines, he talked about friendships, drinking and brawling in seedy bars, hitchhiking from town to town, being stationed on the USS New Jersey, swimming with dolphins in the Pacific Ocean, and boot camp. Dad had been stationed at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. With a wistful expression, he would recall how he and his fellow Marines had to run miles along the beach on the thick sand in their combat boots. The exercise was grueling, and the drill sergeants merciless. Yet when the drill was over, even though they all complained and grumbled, everyone who completed it experienced a sense of achievement and solidarity. My brothers liked the story my dad told of a group of Marines maneuvering under barbed wire on their bellies as they were being shot at with live rounds. One Marine kept sticking his butt in the air. The drill instructors continually yelled at him to get it down, but he continued to jut it out until it took a bullet. The guy was out of commission for weeks, but he had a great time holding court in the infirmary. To this day, I wonder if that story is true. From the time I was very little, I was aware of my father's pride in being a Marine. When I was 3 years old, in the days before children's car seats, I would stand between my parents, feet digging into the soft leather of the big front seat, and sing the entire Marine Corps hymn at the top of my lungs. From the halls of Montezuma, my father would sing with me. My brother Richard served in the Marines in the late 70s, and my brother-in-law Jim served in the Army around the same time. Military service was prevalent in my family and my husband's family, and we were taught to respect it. The 1960s and 70s produced good war movies, and I saw most of them. Battle of the Bulge, The Great Escape, Patton, The Devil's Brigade, The Dirty Dozen, A Bridge Too Far, and many more. When my boys were old enough, my husband and I shared these old films with them, and we also watched and discussed contemporary war movies, Platoon, Apocalypse Now, Good Morning Vietnam, and The Thin Red Line. We talked about how war best exemplifies the camaraderie of men, especially when in battle, and puts people in positions to think about what they value, making them put their integrity on the line. The subject fascinated me. I had always believed that war brings out the best and the worst in people. This belief would come to dominate my life in a way I never would have imagined at the time. My own thoughts about war evolved over the years. The United States' involvement in Vietnam had begun before I was born. By the time I was 13, I already felt very conflicted about it. My father supported our presence there and believed we were doing the right thing. I loved and respected my dad, so I was deeply influenced by his opinions. But I had teachers I also respected who were telling me our involvement in Southeast Asia was wrong. By the time I was in high school, I had decided that Vietnam was not at all a moral war and we didn't belong there. I got into an argument with my father about it. I'd never shouted at him before, and I remember becoming very angry and running out of the room in tears. After that, we never spoke about Vietnam again. Looking back, I can understand the conflict he must have felt. The senseless destruction, loss of life, and government deception clashed with his belief that ours is a righteous country. The first Gulf War started when Pat and Kevin were in their early teens and Richard was 10. I felt it was an unjust war. As with Vietnam, we had not been attacked, nor had we been threatened. A motivating factor was oil, and I believed it was unacceptable, outrageous, and inhumane to put lives on the line in a fight over oil. I also was appalled when President George H.W. Bush told the people of Iraq to rise up against Saddam Hussein, and then backed out, leaving the Kurds to be slaughtered by Hussein's men. No one knew what was going to happen in the region. I wondered at the time if tensions there would escalate due to our involvement. My sons were getting closer to draft age by then. There might come a time when the draft would be reinstated and they would be called. Because we had talked so much with the boys about the honor of military service, I wanted them to understand that this was not the kind of war to get into. I did not glorify this war. The briefings to the public by Generals Norman Schwarzkopf and Colin Powell did not stress the serious nature of what was happening, and it disturbed me that the daily visuals from the war zone looked like video games. My sons spoke of the war as cool. They had trouble understanding that people were dying. My husband and I would remind them, "You're not seeing the death there." Curled up on my couch, securing the blanket over my shoulders, I recoil. All of those discussions of the military and the honor of serving come back to haunt me. Through tear-filled eyes, I look out the picture window into the darkness.
Mary Tillman, reading an excerpt from her book Boots on the Ground by Dusk, my tribute to Pat Tillman. Army Ranger and NFL star Pat Tillman was killed by fire from his own troops in Afghanistan 4 years ago. He and his brother Kevin had joined the Army after 9/11.